So welcome, Shane. Shane was a member of the House of Bridget Dublin. He was in my community last year. And he did a lot of work with the Soup Run team while we had that. It's been kind of put on pause since COVID, but he did a lot of really good work with that group during his 2 years here in Dublin. You're calling from Colorado now, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And so you can kind of introduce yourself, tell people what you've been up to since
Yeah. Thank you, Maddie. Sure thing. So yeah, my name is Shane Jenkins. I was the House Director for House of Bridget, just ahead of Maddie, for the 2 years before I left. COVID kind of interrupted that, but that's okay. I've kind of transitioned now to living back in my home state of Colorado, and I actually work for a kind of startup that does crowdsourcing services at the moment. But that's my hobby. My real focus is well, not really, but I do love focusing on all sorts of like topics of theological art, or how to live our faith more truthfully, or ethical questions for just individual life as well. And so I kind of pursue those on the side, as I did have an education in theology and liberal arts in college. But yeah, during my time at the House of Bridget, I did volunteer with the Soup Run, but I was a complete newbie to it. And so today's talk is not really going to be about how to fix homelessness or kind of what the answers are, but I will be giving some insights as someone who learned what it's like to engage with this ministry, having had no background in it, and what some of the surprising lessons I learned were that shaped my sense of what I can do as an individual. Like, what are the small things I can do? And so, yeah, that'll kind of be my talk today. So thanks, Maddie.
Yeah, and we can jump right in if you want to.
Sounds great. And yeah, as people are coming in here, if you want to maybe put something in the chat that says what you said about the questions, then they can catch it as they're coming in. But let me share my screen really quickly with a little presentation. Now, if people just want to nod, I believe you could probably see this, correct? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, sounds good. So I've titled this intentionally out of my league, a little bit putty, but really it's just meant to convey that this is something that I knew was going to be difficult for me to engage with for the first time, something that I didn't know a lot about. And in fact, I'd grown up kind of learning that you need to be careful around homeless people. They're dangerous in a sense, or they're unpredictable. You don't know them. They're effectively strangers. And so coming with that perspective into homeless ministry, it was certainly a jump for me. But anyways, let me get started. This should be fairly simple, but hopefully enjoyable. So, I should also ask, can people see this as a full presentation, or are they seeing it kind of with the black bars on top?
You see it with the black bars on top.
Okay, let me try to stretch that out, sorry.
That's okay.
That's a little better. Okay, so I thought I'd first start with just telling people about homelessness in Ireland. Like, is it an issue? Which is a fair question. And if you can see on this graph here at the left, as far as the Irish government has been reporting monthly homeless statistics since July 2014 to its peak in December of 2019, there is a 200% increase, or like tripling, of the amount of homeless people in emergency accommodation in the country. And this is a trend that was upward since the 2008 financial crisis. And so truly homelessness has been on the rise for the past 15 years, more or less. And it wasn't as big of a problem back then as it is now, clearly. And so there is an issue of homelessness in the country. But one thing that's been a bit interesting is that if you notice at the pandemic level that I've highlighted there, for the first time in about a decade, homeless levels have started to go down in terms of the reported numbers. Now this probably raises some questions as to like, why is that? Is it suddenly that there are more hotels available? And that is part of the case. Like, it could be that there's just more emergency accommodation available to share. But in truth, these homeless numbers that you're seeing here don't really refer to what we think of as homeless when you see people on the streets. those are rough sleepers is kind of the term used for them. And they don't really appear in this count that we're seeing. And so in fact, what you're seeing with this drop here is most likely, according to homeless advocates, caused by the freeze on rent hikes, as well as the ban on evictions during high lockdown phases. And so it's not necessarily that people who were on the streets are getting into accommodation more easily. It's just that those who were being evicted, or those who couldn't deal with increased rent, or those who were falling out of their current state of housing are finding a little bit more support during the pandemic. And thus the numbers have kind of trended downwards. With that in mind, I mentioned something about rough sleepers not being counted in that. The truth is, we don't fully know how many rough sleepers there are on the streets. The best count that we have, which is run by the Dublin Region Homeless Executive, varies between 100 to 200 people. And that's a count that's only done twice a year. So in some ways it is never going to be perfect. But those are the people that you would probably imagine when you think of, when I walk to work every day, I see this same person on the street, or I see this person camping along the canal. So that's something to keep in mind. That'll be the group that I've worked the most with during my time with House of Rigid. And I'll be talking about the rough sleepers. But secondly, as you can kind of see with the caption at the bottom, there are also people who don't fall into either category and are not tracked, such as if there is a child who left an abusive home and was couch surfing at a friend's, or a family who was evicted but then did not enter the housing support system and instead has paying off their own dollar for hotel rooms. There are lots of sort of like in-between cases of people who are homeless but are not tracked because they're not part of the recorded system where people are put on a waiting list and given accommodation with time. And that waiting list is large, sadly. But anyways, I thought this would be some helpful statistics just to give you a sense of what the picture of homelessness in Ireland, and that it is something that has grown as a trend since the financial crisis and is largely caused by issues with housing prices and rental prices constantly moving upwards. But that there are hopefully some solutions, that the sign that it can go down, as we've seen in this pandemic, is a good sign. But anyways, since we know about this now and that it is a bit of a problem, what does it have to do with Newman Church? And I thought I'd explain it through looking at one of the founders or inspirers for John Henry Newman, who founded Newman Church. For those who don't know, the Oratorians of St. Philip Neri is the not really congregation, but community of priests that St. John Henry Newman joined when he became a Catholic priest. He couldn't decide if he wanted to be a Dominican or a Jesuit or a Franciscan until he met this community in Rome that was different in that they respected the freedom of all of the individual members and all of the individual communities or oratories. And something about that spoke to him. But to give some background on who St. Philip Neri was and how he was related to homelessness ministry, when he arrived in Rome in the 16th century, he was theologically trained, but was not a priest by any means. And yet he wanted to live his life supporting and guiding people to holiness as much as he could. So what he did was, after selling all of his books to give his money to the poor that he could, and finding housing with a local middle class families in exchange for teaching their children, he would spend his days going on the streets, encountering people, and became famous for encountering them with a surprising level of charity and concern. It was shocking to a lot of people, particularly to local church authorities, in that he wasn't a priest and he was going around preaching to people, serving them, visiting the sick and the homeless and the poor and prostitutes as well, and trying to encourage them to recognize that they were loved and to live with that recognition, to live in the dignity of what it means to be like a child of God. But again, because he wasn't a priest, people were concerned that, oh, who is this man who's going out and speaking without authority? And so though Philip Neri did eventually become ordained as a priest, that spirit of service still persisted into the communities that he ended up founding. So when he did found his first oratory, which consisted of both brothers and priests, they continued that service of going out into the community and surprising people with charity. And I say surprise because I think that was really a key element of it. And something that I will mention, we try to emulate today, in that not only was it shocking to those authorities, but it was shocking to the people that they met. They were speaking to them in a way that they didn't necessarily perceive they deserved, or a way they didn't expect, when the norm is to be ignored, or the norm is to be only given the bare minimum. For someone to come up to you and surprise you with actual concern, or to talk to you, or to ask you where you're going in your life, all of that has the power to shake someone out of a cycle, to shake someone out of like a mental trap. And I believe that St. Philip Neri saw that, and then knew that they could reach people by surprising them with mercy and kindness in a way that none others had. But moving on from that, John Henry Newman, when he was founding his oratory in Birmingham and Newman Church in Dublin, incorporated a bit of that service as well, in that the members of these oratories are oftentimes priests from a wide community who all live together and have their separate parochial duties, but in between, they're still encouraged to serve the poor or the sick in some way. And so in Oxford, for example, of which there's a picture of the community here, and at the Brompton Oratory in London, which have extended from Newman's return to England, they still have homeless ministry in which people from the local area can engage with them and support them, and be a part of that process. However, in Dublin, John Henry Newman wasn't really founding an oratory so much as a university. And though I don't know if there was any extensive form of service for the students who were at the university, I do know that when the Notre Dame Newman Center was invited to steward the parish after kind of years of mixed use, we desired in some way to bring back a spirit of that service. And it just happened to be very fortuitously that while we were looking for a way to get re-engaged with this service and offer it in some way, a local group who had already started kind of came to our doorstep. And so I will talk about the forms of service that we do have, but the primary one that I was a part of was this Wednesday soup run. And what I mean by people coming to our doorstep was, at the neighboring Opus Dei community, some of their friends and supporters had already started a soup run in that building, but were looking for a new location and a wider parish to kind of invite members from. And so we said, oh, let's work together. This is perfect. And we invited them into our church space, and we started hosting Wednesday soup runs wherein anyone could come and help us create or help us make sandwiches, pack bags with snacks, and then also make thermoses of hot tea and coffee. And we would take those items and anything else we had, like socks or hats, and we'd break up into groups of about 2 to 5 people and walk around the streets of downtown, kind of meeting people along the way, asking them if they'd like a tea or coffee, and then intentionally, as you can see with this guy in the background here, kind of getting down on our knees or squatting and talking to people for a while if they wanted to talk. And if not, we would move onwards. So at the moment, this ministry has been paused due to the risk of COVID, both for parishioners and for the homeless that we were serving. But I will talk later about some ways we've been trying, or maybe you can try to still support homeless ministry in this time. But I'd like to get at some of the lessons that I learned from this, which might, inspire some discussion later, which is that, as I said at the beginning, I was super nervous about all of this. I kind of came into the experience I came into the service of homeless people with a mindset of caution, with a mindset of uncertainty. And in some ways it's not unfounded in that, like, you do hear stories of people who had dangerous encounters, and you want to sort of respect the concern of those who care about you. But what I learned through this service was there are certain ways in which you can be safer and learn about what it really means to serve somebody in a way that is predictable and respectable, and that absolutely not everyone out there is out there to hurt you. So I guess I'll just start by saying that if you ever do join a group of homeless outreach like the one that I did, a soup run, say, it's okay to be nervous. In fact, in my first few times, I just followed the people who had been doing it for weeks, and I just kind of stood behind them while they did all the stuff, and I observed. And that was okay. Part of it was just being present and challenging myself to kind of see what it was like, and then reframe my picture of what the service was and come into it the second time. Another important thing was learning that this outreach wasn't meant to like fix a problem right then and there. I mean, maybe you could if it was a small thing, but most likely these conversations were just meant to both offer us a humbling opportunity to get to know our neighbors and to see them as more than just a number. But it was also there to say, oh, like perhaps you haven't had an opportunity to speak with somebody like a friend in a while, and we want to offer that to you. We don't have much, we have some comfort food for the moment, but that's kind of our entryway into asking someone to share themselves with us and to support them if we can, and then at the end ask to pray for them. And that was another thing that I learned, was that through meeting these people and revealing who they were behind the number, as I mentioned, we were much more capable of praying for them and thinking of them intentionally. Because whereas you could pray kind of in abstract for homeless at any time, once you get to know somebody and know what someone's problems are, you can love them more truthfully in a sense. So that being said, one other thing I'll mention before I go on to my next slide is that though encountering the homeless can be daunting in a way, because you don't know what to expect, I will say that that unexpectedness also has a benefit in that you will never really find someone that is exactly what you imagine, like fits a stereotype, because although there are trends that do persist across the group, such as maybe coming from an unsafe home or kind of failing through lots of jobs, you'll always find that there is like a motivation or an aspect of their story that is not what you expected, and that restores that person's kind of status as like just a real human being rather than a predictable kind of like robot or number. And so I will say that I didn't really understand that myself until I was able to go out and start meeting people. And for example, found one guy who by appearances looked like any other rough sleeper. When I talked to him, I learned he was only on the street for a week at that point. And before then, he had been trying to work a job to support his daughter. In fact, he had been a prize, he mentioned that he was a prize boxer earlier in his life, but I wouldn't have guessed that. Like I might have thought, oh, maybe he's someone who's struggled with drugs and has just fallen out. But in truth, like I said, he'd only been on the street a week. And so you don't really learn about the reality of people's situations, or the fact that sometimes rough sleeping is not caused by irresponsibility so much as it is as being forced into it. For example, we also had cases where women were fleeing abusive homes where none of their family members defended them anymore, at least as far as they told us. And so they instead found it much safer to be surrounded in Dublin, but with like anonymity, than it was to be back in their small hometown where kind of everyone knew them for what they were afraid of. But that being said, that sort of has to do with the fact about when you encounter the homeless, you learn about who they really are and what their problems really look like. But I will say two more kind of interesting lessons that I discovered were that, as I mentioned before, there is a concern, especially for those who you might be telling you're going to help the homeless. They might say, well, is that safe? Like, can you predict what they're going to do? What if they're irrational? What if they lash out? What if they have a weapon? And I would say that those aren't unreasonable questions. Like, it's not that someone is asking that simply because they have a warped view of who homeless people are. Like, that may be part of it, that it's uninformed, but asking about someone's safety is reasonable in a sense. And yet I want to share some insights that I had that really comforted my understanding of this. One of them is that when you go out with the Supran team, which is always a group of 2 or more for the safety of having numbers to support you, the other thing is that you're not engaging people who don't want to be engaged. And so in the same way that if you were on a long car ride and like a younger brother would put in his headphones and look out the window, you can read that they do not want to be bothered. You can read that they aren't looking for engagement at that moment. And yet there could also be people who are, people who are looking around, who are talkative. And it's a similar thing with the homeless on the street. I've included 2 images here of those who are bedded down, looking away from the street. And the thing is, that is a desire for privacy. The only difference is that they don't have a place to express it. They don't have a room to go to. And so it's hard to tell. But with the other woman in the bottom right, it's the opposite, where oftentimes you'll encounter people who are actively trying to engage with passersby. They're looking at them. They might be asking for assistance. And as a soup run, we would only go to these people. So there isn't really a risk of surprising someone who's asleep or annoying someone that doesn't want to be bothered. And in a way, you could also look at it that if someone is actively asking for assistance, asking for engagement, asking for society, it seems unlikely that they would then want to harm the very person that was helping them. Like there is certainly a sense in which, oh, the horse can bite the hand that feeds it. But for the most part, at least in my experience, especially with the group, people were very generous, and in fact, were, like as I mentioned, surprised by charity, and thus were opened up to that experience. And people surprise you. There was one woman that I knew who was outside the Bagot Street Tesco most every night, and people would come out and give her food and stuff, leave it by her, but she would offer her food to us and to other homeless people as we walked by, because she's like, I don't actually need all this, you know. And so we'd see her walk down the street and give it to a foreign homeless woman who couldn't speak English. And so you'd be surprised that a large amount of the homeless people actually do have a sense of community or a sense of looking out for one another. Not all, but as you go on these homeless outreach experiences and start to recognize people or start to learn the signs, that sense of safety or that sense of predictability does increase a little bit. So I just wanted to say that. And then one last insight that I'll mention before I kind of move into this question phase is that I think something that I really worried about coming into this, and this might have been an American mindset, was that I really worried about my charity being taken advantage of, or my charity being turned around as something that was enabling people, right? Oftentimes when you tell people you are offering a form of homeless service, they will say, well, aren't you just perpetuating their problem? Aren't you just kind of like not giving them a hard enough tough love kick to say like, come on, you can do it, get back up? And I wondered and wrestled with that for a while. But what I saw was that our charity, for one, was certainly not enabling, in that it was every other week, it was like a cup of coffee and a sandwich. And so there's no sense in which people are relying on that for all of their food or all of their sustenance. And then second was that it's true that people will take advantage of your charity. It's true that we had people rush by us, ask for a cup of coffee really quickly, and then get going so that they could hang with their buds or do whatever. And that we had no chance to encounter them. We had no chance for that opportunity to ask how they're doing, to sort of get at what the intention of our ministry was, or to get to know them. But that was also okay, because even if we had 20% of people who were like that, you needed to have this indiscriminate charity to reach the other 80%, and to also recognize that what you're losing in that 20% is like euros worth of food. And so it's in a sense putting into context what the sacrifice is for the greater sake of what you're doing was helpful for me. In that I think for oftentimes I became so focused on just the pure platitude of like, I don't want my charity to be abused, because then people can say my charity is pointless. When in fact, like, knowing that charity is not something that demands an equal return, is something that is freely given, really changed my understanding of knowing that it is okay to go out with the understanding that you're going to lose a little bit, but that it's necessary to reach those who really need it, and that the other 80% absolutely appreciated it. Talked to us in some cases for like half an hour, and we're sad that we had to go. And so I would just encourage people to know that it is okay to kind of like give indiscriminately, as I said, knowing that most of the time the net gain is far greater than what you're losing, and that it is worth losing some of your time if you're helping somebody who needs it. And so I think that was all I was trying to get at there, but hopefully that makes some sense. And you can feel free to ask me questions about any of this. As I mentioned, I might talk a little bit about what we can do now that COVID is here, and what Newman Church is able to do as well. And excuse me, there is a vacuum back there, but it should be gone soon. But yeah, with that, I will go on to this let's talk about it phase, and let Maddie field some questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Shane. Yeah, so we're going to move into the Q&A portion. And so we have two questions in the chat here. Number one, I'll do them one at a time. What do you think about the relative balance between giving time / doing direct ministry and giving money to organizations that help the homeless?
That is a great question. And again, I'll preface all these answers with the notion that this is just my insights from as somebody who's wondered what can I do as an individual, and I'm not necessarily an expert like someone who, say, works with Focus or the Simon community of Dublin. But with that being said, I have learned that not everyone has to be the person on the ground, or that not all homeless ministry is done in the soup run setting. I think that is particularly helpful to someone who wants to engage with the homeless and meet them, because you kind of get a chance to know who they are. But speaking to that balance, at least as far as I can see, it's needed in all senses. That the St. Vincent de Paul Society or the Peter McVerry Trust, they're places where large amounts of people go to access like rain gear, clothing, IT support. And if they don't exist, no soup run's going to be able to offer those items in the same way. And so I think it is truly important to make sure that we're also supporting those communities that have the sort of centralized heft and voice to advocate for our homeless friends. And so even, I guess one example may be if someone is incapable of attending a soup run, whether it's due to their life circumstances or age or something, there are so many ways that you can, still support those who are helping the homeless, either through, in our case, we had our elderly choir members oftentimes would donate money to help us buy socks for the soup run. That's one example of how their monetary support was essential to what we were doing. But in the other sense, even advocacy is incredibly important, in that one fear a lot of these homeless advocates have right now is that, will people after the pandemic say, oh, well, the numbers went down, like clearly we've done something right and it's working, and then as soon as all these COVID policies disappear and things get back to normal, well, people have kind of ignored the issue. And so one thought is just make sure that you're still cognizant of making sure that it's heard, and that it's not okay that the numbers are just were essentially constantly increasing until a global pandemic occurred. I think that would be my thought on that.
Okay, and second question, do you think it's best to think of homeless ministry as a matter of charity or a matter of justice?
Ooh, great question. I'll have to think about this a little bit, because I think those words do have kind of strong connotations. And so if my understanding is that charity has to do with kind of interpersonal care and love, in the sense that it's a calling of recognizing someone's humanity, whereas justice is, in a sense, is about ensuring what is owed and what is right, what is deserved. It's hard to see it as anything but a bit of both, in that I think the charity side absolutely comes to do with our calling to recognize somebody for what they really are, and not to, as I mentioned, kind of, oh, sorry, what was that? Oh, sorry, I thought I heard somebody clarifying. But anyways, the charity side has to do with challenging yourself to see somebody as a human, and kind of dispelling that issue, or that notion of them as just a number or a stereotype. Whereas the justice side has to do with making sure that the policies that define our society value the people who are vulnerable, and recognize that not all homeless people are homeless for straw man reasons, and so I think that would be my response there too, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, okay. Then next question.
Mm-hmm.
We see a lot of our Christian brothers and sisters putting a strong influence on practical works of mercy and charity. Do you think Catholics downplay it, and do we need to prioritize it more?
Yeah, another great question. I will say, at least in America, which is another part of my experience, there is a rather notorious divide between evangelical Christians and Catholics, and that evangelical Christians are well known for having quite robust forms of service to the poor and homeless. And yet it doesn't mean that Catholics don't have their own versions of it, but I think there is a way in which it's less common for people to say have a whole parish-wide event devoted around like a soup kitchen or something. It's usually like a smaller group within. And so Ireland's a little bit different, being a primarily Catholic country, that there's no comparison to see in such large numbers. But I would say that I think there is more that people could do as a parish in helping homeless communities, or at least supporting it, even if they're not doing a direct soup run. For example, a lot of parishes do support the St. Vincent de Paul Society with like seasonal collections. That's a great element of it. But if you could extend that into a form of I don't know, like educational calling, wherein you're not only physically supporting people, but you're getting to know who they are and to see them as neighbors and part of the parish rather than outsiders. I think challenging a community to see itself as responsible to those who live nearby, like the well-being of those who are within the parish boundaries, so to speak, could be something that Catholics could improve upon, and would honestly be pretty cool for the world to see if they say like, oh, every individual parish like takes the well-being of all of its local members like into account, whether Catholic or not. Like that's pretty cool, because then it sounds like their faith is informing their actions, you know, and it's not necessarily just like a side hobby, which is nice, you know.
Yeah, thank you, Shane. Okay. Did you ever get the sense when on a soup run that people would be saying, oh, here come the do-gooders?
Yeah, and honestly, like I think that's something to be incredibly aware of as someone who's on a soup run. I think a temptation when you enter something like this is to see oneself as a sort of savior, or as someone who is giving their resources very generously to the people who need it. And like that should be taken seriously. Like we aren't there in a sense to inflate our sense of self. But at the same time, serving the homeless is not, how should I put it? It's not a completely isolated activity, in the sense that when you serve someone, you're there and you're a part of it. Like in a sense, you will benefit by helping somebody. Like, would you, like, for example, if we wanted to remove any sense of personal interest from service, we would just have robots do it, because then you could say like, oh, at least it's anonymous. Like that person who fell on the street, and like the Good Samaritan in a sense. Sorry, I'm saying when the Good Samaritan walks by and helps somebody, if they said that Samaritan was only self-interested, it's sort of missing the point that all forms of interpersonal service will have an element of two parties. And so I think all I'm trying to say is that being conscious of the fact that you aren't a savior, and they're being humble enough to say that I'm offering you very little, but what I am offering in a sense is my care and concern, and my continued kind of interest in your well-being. I think then it's a little bit more reasonable to say that we aren't really there for ourselves. We're there because we believe it's an injustice we want to fix, but we're also there because we just care, you know?
Yeah, thanks. Okay, I have one.
Sure. And if I want me to talk about COVID or Newman's response too, I can also do those, but go ahead.
Yeah. Did your ministry with the Super Run team give you a deeper understanding of your own faith life?
Another good question. I think this is tough in a sense, because it has absolutely helped form my understanding of what that gospel call to live in the sense that you're treating God with that same love and charity. It's something that I understood in abstract before, but not necessarily in practice. And I think doing that, or being a part of this ministry, has helped me grow in confidence to say that this is a part of the good spiritual life that can be done. It's a part of the good spiritual life that is accessible to individuals. It's not just a big issue that, because I can never have an impact, I just shouldn't bother engaging with. Like, not having an impact and not fixing systemic homelessness are two different things, and that you can have an impact on individuals' lives. You can have an impact on your own understanding of who lives around you and how you treat them. And that, for me, like, the gospel call is made more real and more possible in that way. And so I'd say it has informed me in that sense. And then secondly, in the sense that we've had stories, I don't want to focus too heavily on them for the sense that they're hard to convey the reality of, but we've had many encounters by people in our group who they meet somebody who has asked them to pray for them. And then when we come back at the end of our soup run, we'll typically name the people we've met and an intention for them if they have one, and then pray them in memorare. But we've had moments where people, in a sense, feel or understand that prayer has been said for them, or they experience some element of grace in the coming weeks. And then when we see them again, they might tell us about it. And it's in no way like a one-for-one, oh yeah, our prayers are guaranteed to fix people. It's more just that it does show that when we try to base our service and prayer as well, we allow space for God to assist in our service and not make it purely about our efforts. And so I'd say I learned a bit about that too.
Okay. Yeah. Matthias says, I got a chance to be involved with the Newman soup run, and I was struck by the obvious gratitude of so many of the people we would meet, and also by the sense of solidarity with the other people who were involved and the different kinds of people who were helping out: students, working people, members of the choir, older and younger folk, almost mirroring the people we were meeting on the streets. Does any of this chime with your own experience?
Yeah, that's a really, really lovely description, Matthias. Thanks. I think that diversity of people is incredibly true, because even within the Newman soup run community, we had a variety of people, those who were kind of like, just speaking in general terms, like devout, more traditional Catholics, as well as those who were on the fringe of their faith, coming in because this was an entryway for them into what parish interaction was like. And then this was yet a space that was so equalizing, and so, and I don't know, so vulnerable in a sense that everyone could participate in it in the exact same way, both the homeless and ourselves. And that a lot of those boundaries or pretensions about who is like what disappear when you realize you're just talking to somebody about, I don't know, a lot of people on the streets would ask us about Donald Trump. So like, a homeless person about whatever they want to talk about, like a lot of things kind of disappear and you just become a part of that conversation. They might also talk as well about we had one woman who told us about how she owned a 20-year-old dog named Muttley, and that the dog was clearly homosexual. And we asked her how she knew, and she said, oh, the dog only looks at male dogs when they walk by and never raises its head for female dogs. And so like, when you have stories like that, in a way, they cut through the other distinctions that you might have worried about and bring you fully present to the moment. And so, yeah, I think I would say that diversity Matthias describes does come together in a sense for the brief time we're out there.
Thank you. Yeah, and sorry, I missed, Ben said that he does want to hear stuff about COVID and Newman's response. So if you'd like to talk about that a bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've kept my screen share up here for that purpose, but I'll first go to COVID response and saying that I've pulled some of these from an article where they asked many of the homeless advocate communities in Dublin about what can be done. But I will say that as part of the concern with why we halted our soup run is that whereas, say, the Simon community or focus community soup runs and outreach still exist, they exist in the sense that they have the resources and the commitment of sort of long-term staff to approach it in a way that is completely safe for both those who are participating and the homeless that they're reaching out to. Whereas among our community, because it involves typically much more people, a changing roster of people, and that we may not be able to, in a sense, have the authority or approval to outreach to them in that way, we've taken a pause. But even so, there are things that people can still do. For one, supporting any of the homeless advocacy groups that are in Dublin, such as the Simon community Focus Ireland, Peter McVerry Trust, Anna Liffey Project, and I'll even show some more in a second here, is incredibly helpful. For example, Peter McVerry Trust has said that they still need towels, makeup, sanitary products, rain jackets, cups, mugs. There's all sorts of things that homeless men and women and families are still in need of, and that they will continue going to these places for. And so the need doesn't stop. And so in a sense, your donations shouldn't stop either if you can't afford to donate. When it comes to people who are sleeping rough though, or who you might still want to encounter more directly, Anna Liffey Project even brings up the fact that, all the lessons that I described learning about seeing someone more as a neighbor and as an individual person still apply, in that you can greet them and smile at them or give them a kind look as you're walking by. And that one other option that we'd considered at Newman Church, and again, if this is feasible, might be available for you guys to pick up, is that we've created a resource card from our many kind of years of learning about where services are and what people should do. And that this is something that you can still carry with you in your backpack or in your purse. And if you found a homeless person who appeared to be distressed or new, or you just simply know, and you know that they might actually benefit from some of these resources, you could hand them this paper in a way that is minimal contact, doesn't risk them or you, and yet still gives them the information they need to access some of these resources. And so on the front, there's numbers for them to call if they're wanting to get into the system of housing support. Similarly, there's numbers that they can call if they aren't even an Irish citizen. That's on the right side of the first page. But on the back side, we have a map with the various places that have different types of services. For example, the Capuchin Day Center, kind of by Smithfield, they are the center with the most kind of like medical services, where they can do both eye exams and then like a free clinic on some days of the week. But if someone doesn't know that, having this sheet can be excellent for giving them that information that they need to know. And so I will say that it is unfortunate, and hopefully can change soon, that the Newman Center can pick up its old soup run habits. But for the time being, still remembering that there are other places that you can serve and other communities that you can support is just as important. And last, I would just say that I believe, Maddie can correct me if I'm wrong, they have access to this resource document, and so they might print a bunch out and leave them on the back table with all the pamphlets at Newman Church. And so next time you're in, you could just grab 5 or so and keep them with you. And then, as I mentioned, that can be your form of individual outreach during your day or whenever you're out. So yeah.
Yes, we will be putting them at the back of the church. I've also shared the resource sheet in the chat. If you guys aren't in the vicinity of Newman, you can access it that way. So yeah, thank you, Shane.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, if there are no more questions, we can probably wrap up here. And yeah, thank you so much, Shane. That was a really, really wonderful talk. And thanks for giving us your time and yes, and answering our questions. And yeah, thanks so much for spending this time with us.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for coming and letting me share my insight with you. So I appreciate it. It gave me an excuse to make a drink named after me, or not named after me, inspired by my essence. So Italian sunset. Sorry, go on.
Yeah, I just wanted to say thank everyone for joining us tonight. And I know that in previous years we would have done this in person and had wine and fellowship and everything afterwards. So I really appreciate you guys, being willing to switch over to this format and spend this time with us. And yeah, next week we're gonna do ministry and education. The speaker, her name's Winter Kelly. She's actually the principal of my elementary school in the US, and she has about think 29 years of experience in education, and she's going to be talking about intentional ministry in the classroom. She has her MA in educational leadership from Notre Dame, and it's going to be really, really good talk. So if any of you guys would like to join for that, that's going to be next week this time. And yeah, Shane, do you have any closing remarks?
Just thank you as well to the people I know. Quick shout out to Steve, I see you there, and Father Gary, and as well to the Conroy fam and James. Good to see you guys. And thank you as well for joining us here. I appreciate it. So I think that's all I had. Feel free to reach out to me if you have any questions about resources. But
all right, thank you. We'll see you later.
take care.
Bye.
Thank you, Shane.